Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Crack the Automation Code and Create a Balanced Test Strategy, brought to you by Rainforest QA. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Derek Choi. Derek drives technical innovation in scaling a globally distributed engineering team. He also manages product and professional services. Choi joined Rainforest QA from Aria Systems, where he was VP of Engineering and similarly distributed engineering team by 10 times, and supported revenue growth of more than 20 times. Prior to Aria Systems, Choi was Director of Software Development at eBay, where he led product development for its billing platform.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Maybe before we actually get started, let me kind of share with you kind of the agenda for today. So after the introduction, we're going to talk about, a lot about automation today. First of all, I will probably, kind of start off by talking about when does it make sense to automate, right? Automation seems like the thing to do, right? And there's almost kind of a feeling that feels like, well, if you're not automating your test, then you're doing something wrong, right? Is that true, right? And the question is then, when does it make sense to automate? Is it from the very beginning? Is it, once you achieve a certain size, or when you hit a certain, roadblock or milestone? What would that be, right? And so we'll explore that a little bit. And then we'll talk about, the true cost of automation. And there's also kind of a common belief that automation will bring costs down because, just like anything automation, when you do it once and you use it many times, and therefore the cost should be, much lower if we do automation. Is that the case, right? And we'll take a look at what are the costs involved in doing automation. Some of them are hard cost, and some of them are probably, soft costs that we should also consider because there is an impact of that to the organization as well. So we'll take a look at that. And then, we'll talk about what a balanced test strategy looks like. Is automation 100%, the right way to do it? Or is there a better approach where we have a balanced test strategy? And if we do, what would that balance looks like? What should be, done manually through, manual execution, and what should be done through automation? We'll talk about that a little bit, and then we will talk about the tools and processes to implement the strategy. What the balanced testing strategy looks like, and what are the tools and processes involved in doing that, and of course, some key takeaways at the end. So pretty exciting agenda, I think, hopefully very relevant to the things that you're already working on, or maybe you're already halfway through it. We'll have a Q&A time at the end, so feel free to kind of write down your questions. We can discuss it towards the later part of our discussion today. Now, let's start off by looking at, kind of the goal of testing, right? What do people want to do with testing? Now, we've actually done a lot of research. We have, we've gone to the industry and looked at a lot of the industry research. We've also gone to, our customers and take a look at that. Now, what is interesting in this slide, I think, is comparing 2016 and 2017. Specifically in the first column, you see a shift in terms of increasing the quality of software or product as a main goal of testing. Now, there are other, kind of goals as well, right? But you see that the other goals kind of become less important as time goes on, and there are more emphasis on increasing the quality of the software or product. And we're hearing it, across the board, right? Initially people do it for many different reasons in terms of testing, but ultimately as the organization matures, shipping a higher quality product is typically the ultimate goal of testing. And I think that that's probably, pretty common, among the folks that are here. Now then, the question, like we talked about earlier, is, when does it make sense to automate, right? And I think that, there are different kinds of testing, right? There are automated testing, obviously, and then there is manual testing. Now, what is appropriate for each type of testing? In general, I would say that product that is more consistent and doesn't change much is probably a better candidate for automated testing. And we'll go into the cost of automated testing a little bit, but it's probably not a surprise to many of you that there is a pretty substantial startup cost when it comes to automated testing, right? There's costs around, building the automation, which takes a little bit of time. There's also, costs around leveraging engineers that are relatively expensive to actually build these automations. And sometimes, depending on the organizational setup, some of these engineers are actually the same kind of engineers or the same team of engineers that would actually build your product. So you're actually trading off, product features to build test automation. Now, that may or may not be the right decision, but certainly not necessarily kind of a cheap proposition, right? And so, you want to make sure that when you build automation, this is an automation that's once built, that it can be used many times, right? And therefore you get the value out of it, in terms of, recouping the initial cost, so to speak. And we'll talk a little bit more about costs later on. But in general, I would say that a product that is more consistent, doesn't change a lot from sprint to sprint, is probably a better candidate for automated testing. Now, if you have a product that's rapidly evolving, it's still kind of very much in a kind of iteration phase, and sprint over sprint, there's a large amount of things that are changing, then I would say that manual testing might be a good approach to that, because relatively quickly you can actually change a manual test, and there is not a lot of initial upfront cost to set up the manual test. You just have to modify the test cases, and you can get your test change, even if the features actually change significantly from sprint to sprint. There's not a lot that you'll have to throw away as a result of kind of a lot of product changes over a short period of time. So I would say that if you have a product that is still very rapidly evolving, manual testing would be something that you want to consider. Now, what I think is most interesting, and this is the balanced approach that we'll be talking about in a little bit, is around kind of a hybrid approach, right? Typically, when we look at a product, unless you're a very, very early stage startup, right, you will probably have a portion of the product that's relatively stable, that doesn't change a whole lot over time, right? And then you'll have a part of the product that's rapidly evolving because there's a new feature you're developing, there's a V2 part of that feature that you're working on, or something like that, right? And so then you have a portion of the product that is, changing significantly, and then you have a portion of the product that is probably pretty stable, right? And so then you can take a hybrid approach where, for the part of the product that's relatively stable, you can probably automate it with things like Selenium, and there's many other options out there today. Many of them are open source, and we can talk about that towards the later part of the conversation as well. But then, for the part that is changing a lot from sprint to sprint, and sometimes you don't even have, the user stories fully flush out, manual testing might actually be an easier way to get that part of the product tested while it's evolving, because, the manual testers can, work very closely with the engineers and the product managers, kind of from sprint to sprint, to understand, what are the iterations that's coming up, how do I need to change the test cases in order to do that, and because the test cases typically are just kind of plain English written in a document, changing that typically doesn't take up a lot of time, and so they can evolve very quickly as the product evolves. Now, once that part of the product, maybe a couple of sprints later, maybe a quarter later, becomes more mature and things don't change much after that, then of course, it can be a good candidate for automation. I know that when we talk about automation, a lot of times we talk about automating as soon as kind of the sprint is done, right? So essentially, the developers are working on the feature, and as soon as the feature is built, you also build automation that comes with it, so that automation always kind of keep up with the features that are being built. Now, ideally, that would be the case, especially for more mature product, because the automation that you build hopefully will be, kind of reused many times, because the product doesn't change a lot, the next sprint and so on. But if you imagine that you have a product that's changing very rapidly, that kind of strategy, although it sounds very good and it sounds like the right thing to do, sometimes may end up costing you more, and actually costing you to go slower, because you are, spending a lot of time automating things before you can ship it. And unfortunately, those automation that you've built in the next sprint is going to change again. And, chances are you might have to throw at least part of it away, if not the whole thing away, as the feature evolves in the next sprint, right? And so then, if you kind of look at it holistically, then, the time that you spend on automation may not even actually make sense that way, right? So, sometimes I think taking a hybrid approach and looking at it kind of more logically would make more sense, rather than just kind of following a kind of a common belief of automation is always better kind of thing. Now, maybe we'll take a little bit of a pause, right, and then we'll take a poll question as the next topic. Would be curious for all the participants here. Tell us what percentage of your test strategy is covered by automated testing today, just to kind of get a poll of all the audiences that we have today. What does it look like? I'll pause for probably maybe 15-20 seconds so that folks can get their vote in.
Looks like we have about half of the people have responded. I'll give it a few more seconds, and then I'll show the results.
Wonderful.
There are the results.
Very good. Thank you very much. So looking at the results, right, looks like, majority of the people have, less than half of their, tests automated, right? And we have about a quarter of the people that have 3/4, maybe half to 3/4 of the tests automated, and, relatively, smaller percentage that have a higher degree of automation. And I think that makes sense, right? Because automation, as we talked about, is not cheap, right? Now, when we look at this percentage, one thing that easily jump out to people is like, oh, okay, well, it's bad that, a lot of people have very few percentage of their tests automated, right? I don't know that that's necessarily true. And based on my experience and my experience working with a lot of our customers today, I don't know that, say if you're at 25%, automation, right, that's necessarily a bad thing, right? So I would say that, we'll kind of hold off on, jumping to a conclusion there, maybe until we talk about some of these things later on in the webinar. Let's go to another poll. I think it will be interesting to kind of follow up that by asking the question of, for the tests that you have not yet automated, right? Seems like a lot of people have a lot of tests that are not automated, but would like to automate. What are the challenges that you face, right? So again, here I'm gonna pause for maybe 15-20 seconds just to get some feedback in.
We have about half of the people have responded. I'll give it a few more seconds for those last minute responses.
Thank you.
And there are the results.
Wonderful, thank you. That's also, very common and very much expected. We have a good portion that says, hey, I really want to automate them, but there's not enough resources to do that. And again, we talked about earlier, a lot of the resources that we need to do automations are probably engineers that you can actually put to develop new features as well. And so, especially for a younger company, kind of being able to rapidly iterate on your features and getting things out sometimes, is more important perhaps than automating your tests, right? And of course, we have a good percentage where work is in progress, right? And probably faster than faster would be better, but then, in some cases, maybe also limited by, the amount of resources available. Now, we do have a 17% that says, things are changing too frequently. And we just talked about that, right? Automation isn't really the best option. It seems like, some of you have already kind of come to that conclusion also that, for things that are changing too rapidly, it's probably not a good use of, resources to automate things right away. And then, there are technical difficulties, right? Depending on the nature of your application, in some cases, automating some of those features, especially on the front end side, could be very challenging and very time consuming and very brittle as well. And so it's probably not worth doing it given the amount of work and time and effort that you have to put in order to do that. So it seems like there are a good percentage of people that has come to that conclusion as well. Now let's go to the next slide, right, and look at what people in the industry kind of says, right? Looking across kind of the 2 years, 2016 and 17, and when we look at that survey, it's a very, it's very common to, very similar to what you guys have experienced as well. Challenge with test data, environment. In some cases, automation solution does not support, especially mobile testing. There's challenges with processes and with tools and so on and so forth. And if you look at these challenges, a lot of them are probably very common in your world as well. Now, one more question, and then we'll talk about the true cost of automation, and we'll go to the next poll question. The next poll question is around the cost, right? So thinking about the total cost of automation, which include resources, time, systems, tools, and stuff. Based on your experience so far, was it more expensive or less expensive than anticipated? Just kind of curious, what your experience looks like. So again, I'll pause for a little bit and see what you guys think.
We have about half of the audience with their answers in. I'll give it a few more seconds for those last-minute responses. And here are the results.
Thank you very much. So it looks like most people actually find it to be more expensive than expected, and I think that that's a very common, kind of discovery, especially if you go in not kind of fully understanding, what it involves, right? As you kind of go through automation, you will come across situations where you thought it was easy, but it wasn't, and therefore it takes more time and effort to do. Now let's explore some of these things, right? Let's go back to the slide and then explore some of these true costs of automation, right? Now, when you look at the trade-offs, right? I think that you should consider 3 things around automated testing, right? One is creating the automated test, right? And we've already talked about it a little bit. Creating the automated tests generally have a much higher, kind of starting cost or startup cost compared to manual testing, because you are, building automation. Typically, that takes longer, and more importantly, you are using very expensive and very valuable resource to do that. Resource that can probably apply to, building features and maybe fixing bugs and many other things that you need the help on, right? But then you're directing them to create automated testing. So there is definitely hard costs, but there's also a lot of soft costs, kind of trade-offs on, kind of opportunity costs that you have to consider. Now, you also should consider the running costs of automated tests. Now, the good news here is that automated tests typically are relatively cheap to run, right? You can certainly build a runtime environment in your setup to actually run these, right? But you can also leverage a lot of, the common platforms out there that will allow you to run automated tests, things like Sauce Labs and things like that, where, they provide a platform where you can run these tests without necessarily having to set up your own environment or maintain your hardware hardware or things like that, right? And in some cases, depending on kind of your usage pattern, some of these options out there could be actually more economical than actually having your own servers or using the cloud for these testings and stuff like that. In some cases, they can be actually quite expensive comparatively. But the execution of automated tests is generally cheaper than manual execution, because manual execution involves people, and people costs generally are pretty expensive, even if you decide to go offshore and things like that. So so there's definitely an advantage there with in terms of running the automated test. But one thing that people should not kind of take lightly and forget, and maybe this is where some of you are finding automated testing to be more expensive than you thought, is around the maintenance of automated tests, right? I think a lot of people think about the initial creation cost and also the running cost. But I think that, at least in my experience, a lot of people have underestimated what the cost of maintaining these automated tests is, right? Now, what that means is that, sprint over sprint, there are some changes to the features. There are some changes to the direct features where the automation applies, but sometimes it could also be changes to other features that are not specifically directly related to the automation, but the automation kind of touches it or depends on it. And when there are changes to it, the automation breaks, right? And this is where a lot of people say that automated testing can be very brittle, because it can break for unexpected reasons. Now, the problem with that, I think, are twofold. One is, once it breaks, now, of course, you also need to, probably send an engineer in and figure out why it breaks, and hopefully fix it, and then continue, right? So first of all, there's a cost in terms of the engineer's time to do it. Depending on how easy or hard it is, sometimes it could be a matter of maybe minutes or 10, 20, 30 minutes or so. Other times it could be hours, right, to actually address an automation that fails. And if you have multiple automation that fails in a release cycle or in a sprint, it can take a while. Now, and that brings me to the second point. Besides the actual engineer's time, there is also cost in terms of delaying the release cycle because of this, right? If you are releasing, if you're launching a release or something and the automation breaks, now obviously, you're not going to continue the release because, there could be problems with quality. And therefore, suddenly it becomes kind of a bit of a 911 where you have to send engineers in, you have to kind of hold the whole release cycle, wait for the engineers to figure out what's going on. Is it the automation script that broke? Is it, some problems with the features? And if it's a problem with the features, then, you'll have to, obviously fix it, retest. And so, the whole process is going to take a little while. And in the meantime, your release is on hold, right? And if you do any kind of CI/CD where there's an automated release, then, sometimes the release can be happening, kind of off hours, right? And that means either that your whole release is on hold until people come back in the next day or Monday, or that you have to wake somebody up in the middle of the night to look at, an automation script that broke and fix it so that your release can continue. But either way, the cost of maintaining these automated tests is not trivial, right? Now, there are better ways to write automated tests that make these maintenance costs a little bit lower, so that, you can write tests that are more generic in nature, that, can anticipate some of these changes that might be happening so that the test does not break as a result of these, minor changes. So you can accommodate those as well. First, it's not that easy to do, because anticipating what changes are happening is sometimes not, as straightforward, especially for, rapidly evolving product. And secondly, it's also very time consuming to do that, right? So you're thinking about what's coming, and then you're kind of building things in advance for those things. And so, at the end of the day, the cost is not low. So when we think about the true cost of automation, I would highly suggest that you take a deeper look in terms of what it takes to create the test, run the test, but also, maintaining the test, and not to underestimate any of them. Because what happens is, if you kind of go into automation with the hope that, you're going to achieve, a lot of cost savings, and a lot of time saving probably, and not, kind of look at the more realistic picture of it, most of the time, and I think our survey just now kind of spoke to that as well, most of the time you'll find it to be more expensive, probably more expensive in terms of cost, but also more expensive in terms of time as well. And And so, it probably is something that, you do not want to underestimate, because otherwise your automation strategy or your project is probably not going to be very successful. Now, going to the next slide where we talk about a balanced test strategy. We already talked a little bit about that, right? And here we have a table here that kind of lists out the pros and cons of manual and versus automated testing. Now, for a lot of the audience here, you guys are probably experts and you've seen all these, and what's in the table is probably not necessarily any kind of new information or surprises to you. But I think what will be interesting, I think, is to kind of think about your product, your application, and then think about what would be a balanced test strategy looks like, right? Based on kind of the application that you have, based on the team you have, based on the resources you have, right? And all these different factors, what would a balanced test strategy looks like, right? And I would say that there is no standard answer. I have personally, and I've also talked to many of our customers that kind of have a similar experience where they typically started off with manual testing, and then they thought that automated testing is a wonderful idea. So they typically kind of swing the pendulum, if you like, right, from one end, which is manual testing, to all the way to the other end, which is automated testing. And they go, a lot of times they actually go all in with automated testing, right? And then, a couple of months later, they realize that it is more expensive. It's not as easy as they thought. They hit some technical difficulties and stuff like that. And then they kind of swing the pendulum back, to somewhere in the middle where they feel it's a right balance for their test strategy, given all the factors, given kind of where the application is, how quickly things are changing, but also given how what's the resources that they have, how many engineers they have. Is it easy to bring on additional engineers, or is it easier to bring on manual execution resources? And so all these different factors are at play when you create a balanced test strategy. So what I'm trying to say here is that there is no one size fit all. There is no standard percentage that says, 25% manual, 75% automated is the right answer. What I've seen, and based on my personal experience as well, is that the right answer depends on the kind of situations that you're in. But I think that a good QA leader, a good engineering leader will actually sit down, look at these pros and cons, look at their organization, what they're capable of doing, what their resource strategy looks like, what their application looks like, and then come up with a balanced test strategy. Going back to the survey that we had earlier on in the conversation, when some of our participants are saying, I'm only 25% automated or even less, right? Sometimes that might actually be the right balanced testing strategy. That might actually be the right percentage for the organization at that point in time. So my recommendation here is not to imply that anybody would do that, but not to blindly kind of chase a higher percentage of automation as a goal, but more importantly, kind of look at what's most appropriate for your team and for your organization at the time, so that you can create a balanced test strategy that makes sense. Okay, now with that, let's look at the next slide, right? And talks about, kind of the tools and processes to complement your testing strategy, right? Couple questions to think about here, right? Does the tool fit into your current processes and infrastructure, right? What I mean by this is, okay, well, so let's say, I'm going to do Selenium, right? And which is kind of a very common, automation language. Does the language itself, does the tool, fit into my current processes and infrastructure? Can I support it, right? Do I have resources that can, write Selenium scripts, for example? Can I train people to do that? And think about all these things, right? Depending on the language that you're developing in some cases it could be an easy match. In other cases that might not be, right? And so think about that, and think about the cost of doing that as well. Now, does the tool vendor support training and provide good services, right? So if you're choosing a tool, especially, beyond kind of the open source language itself, if you're choosing, kind of a vendor that provides that kind of, ongoing support, or maybe an interface to the tool and things like that, think about that, right? Because, especially if you're kind of starting on that journey, it is very important to have a vendor that's behind you, because you're going to run into problems. You need some help. You need training. Does the vendor provide the support that you need in order to use it successfully? Right. A lot of times, it's not so much about the tool itself. But just like anything else, when you're starting off, you just need the support that you need to be successful there, and make sure that you get the support you need. I would probably, just kind of say one word about relying too much on an open forum to support kind of what you need initially. So obviously, open forums are great, open source, open forums, and we all ask our questions to the community, and there are a lot of very experienced and very enthusiastic people that would help us kind of on the internet in general, and we leverage that all the time. One thing I would say, at least based on my personal experience, is that sometimes while these tips and advice and everything are very useful and very relevant and probably correct, what they don't necessarily understand is the situation in your own team, in your own company, in your own environment, right? And a lot of the decisions, a lot of the answers probably depends on how things are and what you have or what you don't have and stuff like that. It's really hard for people just kind of in an open forum to fully understand that and be able to provide a more kind of specific answer to your question. And so you can probably get some generic answers there, but then in terms of specific help you need and what's the right answer for your organization, maybe it's a little bit harder to get it from an open forum. Whereas if you have a vendor, especially if they have a services arm, they might be able to spend more time with you and really kind of come up with the right answer or the right solution for you. So things to think about. Also think about the budget for the tool, right? I've seen a lot of cases where people underestimate, how much these tools cost, and not just in terms of the license of the tool, that's one thing, but also, what does it take to actually maintain that tool for the organization, right? I think that there is a general perception that, a lot of these tools do not need to be maintained. And, if I subscribe to it, I'll just use it and that's it, right? Now, in some cases, that might be the case. In other cases, it's not, right? And so, depending on the tool that you bring on board, I would suggest that you think through, what would it take to actually maintain that tool, and so that you can work it into the budget. If it takes up, maybe not a full-time engineer to do that, maybe even part-time, that's expensive, right? That's not cheap. And so you want to kind of take that into consideration. Now, we already talked about it at the beginning, what kind of programming languages does it support, right? Does your team, have the knowledge on these languages, right? Or is it a steep learning curve, right? Or would you be able to, in the market that you're in, would you be able to bring on board people that have that experience? I think that is all very important. I work with, especially, customers that are in the international market, and in some specific markets, some languages that are very common here in US is not very common there. And so, if that specific tool that you've chosen or the automation script that automation technology that you've chosen requires experience in a certain language that is not available locally, then that might also hinder your progress in terms of being able to adopt that. So I'll be, careful with that and make sure that you take that into consideration as well. Now, given all these, I would probably share the next slide, which is kind of, the last slide before we go into Q&A. We don't need to actually worry about the details of the slide here. The exact numbers don't matter as much. It's more important that you kind of look at the different factors when it talks about the true cost of testing, right? Here we're comparing the cost of testing a 30 test case with 15 steps each, executed once every 2 days, and kind of that test suite. What would it cost to do it through, Rainforest QA versus, a Selenium-based automation? And you can probably create, a similar kind of model for menu execution as well. The key thing, like we talked about earlier, is to think about not just, the building costs or the execution costs, but think about the triage cost, the maintenance cost, and what I would call the total cost of ownership when it comes to testing, whether it's automated testing, manual testing, or through any other mechanisms that you like. Just to kind of share with you a way to evaluate what the true cost looks like, and make sure that you take all the details into consideration before going in, so that you have a full picture of what you'll be expected to invest before going in. The last thing that you want, frankly, and I've seen I've seen kind of in some cases, is that you go in not understanding what the true cost is, and then halfway through it you realize it's too expensive, and the budget doesn't really allow for continued investment into that, and so then you have to either scale back or cut the program, and probably wasted some time, or maybe even all the things that you've done, and kind of back to square one, and you certainly don't want to do that, and so doing a thorough analysis in terms of the true cost of testing is important. Now, in a slide here, we specifically talk about the hard dollar cost, right? But like we've talked about throughout the webinar, there's also a soft cost to it in terms of resource cost, opportunity cost, and things like that I think should be considered as part of that as well. So I would suggest that before you engage in automation, or maybe the next phase in automation, think about these costs, and think about, based on your experience, what would these costs look like for the different options, and do a thorough comparison before you engage in that. So I think that's pretty much all I want to cover in our webinar today. We'll take some questions coming up, so if you have any questions, please feel free to send it in. But just as a key kind of takeaway, what I want to kind of share in today's webinar is that while automation is certainly a very interesting technology, definitely something that any good QA or engineering leader should consider, it's not necessarily the holy grail. It's not necessarily the ultimate end-all solution for all testing. It's important that you understand the nature of your application, the skills, and the availability of resources in your organization, and what's most important for the business, and then come up with what we talked about as a balanced test strategy. And sometimes the right balance could be 100% automation, could be 100% manual testing, but most of the time I think it's probably somewhere in between. And what percentage that is the right balance for you at the current time depends on all these factors that you should consider before making that final decision. So with that, maybe we'll take some questions.
Great. Our first question is, if we were to have a combination of manual and automated testing, is there any industry standard or guideline on the percent split between automated and manual testing?
We briefly kind of talked about that. I wouldn't say that, and in my experience, I don't think that there is a hot number, right? I don't think that there's a hot number saying, oh, if it's 50-50 or 70-30, then that's right. And so therefore your goal is to work towards that. I would say that as a kind of rule of thumb, and I think that that's probably why this person is asking the question. I think as a general kind of rule of thumb, I would say that for a younger organization, so probably a startup, and while the product is very, very rapidly evolving, I would say that I would err more on the higher side of manual testing, and a lower percentage of automated testing. So I would probably say maybe 70% manual, 30% automated for a younger organization is probably a good kind of benchmark or guideline. Again, right? I mean, it really depends on a lot of factors. So, I'm sure that there will be scenarios where that's not correct and that's not true. But I would say that for younger organizations, kind of erring more, leveraging more manual testing at the beginning while the product is very rapidly evolving, and then, going to automation as the application and the organization matures, I think is probably a better way of doing that. Whereas, for a more mature organization, whereas the product is more stable and less changes, I think a higher degree of automation probably makes sense.
Great. Our next question is, what is the most common reason why companies fail on automation?
I would say that, and this is actually a very interesting question. I would say that it's actually, at a higher level, it's actually the lack of anticipation of what's coming that ultimately causes it to fail. So what I mean by that is, a lot of times I've seen where people underestimated the amount of resources required, the amount of budget required. And so once they get into it, they realize that things are more expensive. And as many of our audiences today also kind of, experience. And so at that point, they don't have the resource that they need. And therefore, they either have to, quickly go hire more resources and therefore, slow things down for the time being. Or that they will have to ask for more budget, which in some cases are not available. And so then therefore, they will have to significantly cut down their automation strategy, or, get it, or even, get it to a point where it's really not meaningful anymore, right? And I mean, behind that, there are many other factors and reasons, like, they hit some, technical difficulties, specifically around, the way that the application is designed, that makes it very difficult, for automation to do. And even if they can do it, the cost and effort and maintenance is just so high that it doesn't make sense, right? Or sometimes, they have difficulty, hiring resources that are capable of doing that, or retaining them. And so there are many different factors. But if I were to kind of sum it up, I would say that the main reason is because I think a lot of people go into automation without fully understanding, what the full scope of it is, but both in terms of time and effort and money and, and technology and everything. And so then they started to run into problems, once they get started, and many of these problems turn out to be too hard to overcome, and probably too much of a distraction to the organization, that they ended up, either just kind of staying at a very low percentage of automation, or that they actually roll it back, altogether. And I've unfortunately, seen a number of those cases, actually very recently, working with a number of customers.
Awesome. Our next question is, what are the scenarios that are typically very difficult to automate?
I would say that the scenarios that are typical, that are very difficult to automate, are more UI related ones. So if you have a UI that is very rapidly changing, and from sprint to sprint, there are a lot of movements in terms of your all the different elements on your UI. Typically, I would say that those are difficult scenarios to automate. Mobile is also another area where automation right now is relatively more challenging. There are more and more technologies that are being developed to automate mobile, but in general, just because of all the different variations with mobile and all the instability and the changing, kind of even at the platform level, with the OS providers, I think that automating mobile testing is actually relatively more complicated at this time. So if you have, mostly kind of a back-end type testing, I would say that that's probably a better candidate for automation. Typically, a lot of the back-end technology and comparisons and things like that can be easily automated, and they can run pretty consistently, and the amount of changes are not as significant. And even if they change, the changes required on the automation side is typically not as substantial compared to front end, compared to mobile. And so I would say that back end is probably a better candidate, whereas front end, it depends, and then mobile is probably a little bit harder at the moment.
Awesome. Our next question is, are you including performance testing when you discuss automation?
That's a great question. So for the context of what we talked about, it is not, right? It's more around functional testing. However, automated testing does have an element of load and performance testing that we can consider. Having said that, mixing the two of them, in my opinion, is probably not necessarily a good strategy, because the technologies required to do automated testing for functional testing is typically different from the automated testing that we're talking about for load and performance testing. And so, so I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, if we do automated functional testing, then a big part of it can be applied to do load and performance testing, and therefore you're killing two birds with one stone. Typically, that is not the case. There might be components that can be kind of shared, or like strategy that could be common between the two. And in some cases, I've also seen, which I think it's probably not necessarily always the right strategy. I've also seen people kind of brute forcing kind of an automated functional test and use it as kind of a load and performance testing. Like, for example, you write an automated test, you run it on Sauce Labs, for example, and then you run it so many times that you try to kind of simulate a load and performance testing based out of that. Theoretically, you can do that. One is you'll find that the cost to be relatively, cost prohibitive in most cases. But secondly, this is not necessarily the right way to do automated testing. To do performance testing, and you're not necessarily, measuring the kind of things that you want to measure out of that. So I would say that the topic that we're talking about today is related to functional automated testing, and load and performance test is probably a different topic on its own.
Great. Our next question is, how difficult is it to automate testing in agile environments?
It is, how difficult? Well, I would say that it is definitely doable, right? In an agile environment, what you want to do is you want to, again, right, create a balanced test strategy, right? If you say that, now, again, we've talked about a little bit earlier, there are people that are very kind of, kind of sticking to the principle and say, okay, well, I have a agile methodology. I'm, punching out a bunch of things, every sprint, right? And, ideally, I would like to automate those things as they come out so that the automated test is ready. I'm testing those features at the end of the sprint, based on the automated test, and if they pass, I'll push it, and so on and so forth, right? And so, they try really hard to kind of integrate automation into the agile methodology fully, and theoretically that's a good idea, right? Because every single new features that you've created, you already have an automated test to it, and then you can run your feature against those tests, and if they pass, the quality is right, and then you roll it, and there's no backlog in terms of things that needs to be automated and things like that, right? I mean, it's ideal, right? But then again, right, you have to think about the cost of doing that. Now, first of all, that's the question, right? Is doing that is actually quite hard, right? Because you want to be able to move fast, but then writing automated tests also takes time, and it also takes time to run it and troubleshoot it and get it right. And so then doing all these fitting into an agile cycle sometimes could be very challenging. It's possible to do. I've seen it happen. I have it, in my organization as well. But then it is not easy, I would say, right? Definitely a lot of challenges to think through. And therefore, I think that sometimes a more balanced test strategy might be a better idea, where you have manual testing that is kind of integrated into the agile cycle, right? And then for features that are more mature, maybe after a couple of sprints or something, then there is a pipeline to actually get those automated so that you don't have to do manual testing forever, right? So if you are in a position where you can do full automation with agile, good for you, and it's probably takes some time to get that set up, but if it's already running, it's running great, and it's working, then that's awesome. That ultimately is probably a good place to be at. But if you're not there, then I would say that it will probably take some effort to get there, and maybe you should consider the balanced test strategy in the meantime as a way to get there, rather than kind of forcing 100% automation into the agile cycle.
Awesome. Our next question is, what is your recommendation for time and effort spent on automating more challenging features? Are there ways to tell when it is worth it or not?
Yes, I would say that especially for more challenging features, and I would assume that more challenging features meaning more challenging to automate, right? I would say that then the bar of doing that is higher because of the amount of effort and time required to do that. And what I mean by the bar is again, how likely that my automation is going to be reused many times before I have to change it again, right? And for a feature that's pretty simple to automate, doesn't take that much effort, I guess the bar is probably lower. Even if I use it X number of times, I'm already in a positive ROI, so that's probably good. And assuming that I have resources to do that, then that's probably a good idea, right? But if we come across a complex feature that's very difficult to automate, then I would say that the bar is much higher because I have to invest a lot to automate it. And if after automating it, I'm only using it for a small number of times, and it's changed again, and I have to do that effort, maybe not from scratch, but still pouring in significant amount of time in order to get that automation change because of the complexities involved, then the ROI is probably not going to be there, right? And I might be better off just testing that manually, right? And so I would say that the answer to that really, it depends on how mature that complicated feature is. If it's relatively mature and there's very little changes after that, then I think it's probably worth spending the time to get that automation done, even though it's complex. But if that's not the case, then I would avoid doing that, because that's just gonna frankly take up a lot of your time for very little benefits at the end.
Great. That looks like it was our last question. Is there anything you would like to add, Derek, before I close things off?
No, I think that's all very good questions. Thank you for all your attention. And like I said, automation is a very interesting topic. There's a lot of developments in it. Things are evolving very, very quickly. But I think it's very important to take a very balanced view of that and not necessarily just doing it for the sake of doing it. Hopefully, this webinar gave you some ideas around what to consider, what are the costs involved, and what are the factors that you should be thinking about. And looking forward to more sharing in the future.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you, Derek, for a great presentation today. I'd also like to thank today's sponsor, Rainforest QA, for providing the DZone audience with a great webinar presentation. And lastly, thank you to everyone who showed up for today's presentation. We hope you learned something new that'll help you in your developer career. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.